I'm now so very pleased to introduce our next panel around what's the big deal about big data. And I'll welcome our panelists to join me on the stage, Steve Holder, Jason GARAY, and our co-chair, ELYSE ALLAN. If you join me on the stage, thank you. And as our panelists are taking their seats, I will do quick introductions. ELYSE, welcome back. We all are getting to know you as our co-chair of this wonderful event, President and CEO of GE. A pleasure to have you again. And Jason GARAY beside ELYSE, Vice President of Analytics and Informatics for Cancer Care Ontario. In his current role, Jason leads the development of data collection, analysis and reporting capability, and managing a team, building expertise and discipline in the translation of large data sets to provide insight and knowledge aimed at driving improvements in health system performance. And by way of background, Jason's an epidemiologist by training, holding the position of Director, Communicable Disease Prevention and Control at Public Health Ontario. And on his left is, or my left, Steve Holder, National Lead, Analytics and Big Data, SAS Canada, responsible for driving analytics solution strategy for Canada and providing thought leadership in analytics and big data. Steve has seen firsthand how the use of analytics helps customers solve the most intractable problems, and he brings over 2 decades of software industry experience spanning management solutions, architecture, pre-sales, and sales. So welcome to our panel. Now let me get going with our first questions. ELYSE, this morning, I'll move to Steve for an initial definition, but you talked about big data and the industrialization of the internet. I bet if we polled the room, we'd find many definitions of big data. Steve, why don't you kick us off with a definition of big data?
Yeah, sure. ELYSE actually teed it up this morning pretty well, talking about these trends, these 3 things that have driven this phenomena that we call big data, and they're pretty simple. People are now willing to give information a lot more freely. Mobile phones and the internet have provided us platforms to actually capture information like never before. I think the technology evolution and some of the advancements in processing power and computer services allows people to store and process things that they couldn't dream of before. And this whole concept of a kind of social, where people are openly giving information and using that to drive different outcomes, those trends kind of converged in the 2008 timeframe. And I actually, before this session, did a little bit of digging into say, where did the term big data come from? And it dates back into the 60s and 70s with papers, but in around the 2000 timeframe, somebody coined the term big data. And one of the papers that we read talked about volume, velocity, and variety. And quite simply put, volume is, there's a lot of it, it's big. The velocity is it's coming at us faster than we can process it. And the variety is it's all different types. And I think those 3 V's have kind of been the foundation for big data through 2008 to recently. And what I'm seeing is it's kind of waning, the definition. Mm-hmm. Big data doesn't necessarily mean anything to people. If I say to you, what does big data mean to your business versus a business over there or a government agency, it can vary because size doesn't dictate value. So I think it's important to think about big data in your construct. And for me, it's about how do we define a business problem? Data is just data. So big data is really interesting, but the outcome or the insight, I think the governor at lunch talked about the insight or the outcome. That's what big data to me is all about. And I give you one example that we can maybe relate to. Anybody have a mobile phone in the room, right? Everybody does. There's apps on our phone. I use one called Waze. And it's not by far, it's not the only one, but this app allows me to navigate traffic, allows me to get to where I'm going. So it's a part GPS, but it's generating data about the people in front of me who are also running the app. It allows you to tag the traffic and say there's construction here, there's police here. And to me, that kind of encapsulates a big data application. And what's really interesting for me, because SAS works in analytics and big data across a variety of industries, is that's a consumer-based application that's really interesting and cool, and it adds value to my day. I get to bring that to organizations, and Jason, I think, will talk a little bit about what he does, but we get to bring those technologies to organizations so they can solve business problems. And those business problems run the gamut from, in healthcare, we can help organizations look for prescription fraud and look for areas to make sure that the programs have good integrity from a government agency perspective. If you're in a manufacturing concern, we can help look at how to optimize your line and predict asset failure or predict part failure so you eliminate downtimes. To me, those are big data problems, and I think big data is really about three things. It's about solving something that you didn't think you could solve. It's about making the things that you do better, kind of like what the governor was talking about today. And finally, really making new business models and new business outcomes that you couldn't dream possible. It's kind of like Wealth Simple or Job Bliss. They're new business outcomes that we never even had dreamt of before we had this data and this phenomena. So that's a definition from me.
Steve, terrific. And maybe continuing on with examples, Jason, I'll turn to you. And to pick up on Steve's point, what's an example of an initiative that was solved because of big data, but the key is it wouldn't have been possible without it?
Sure. So I think it's, and thanks, Steve, for the definition. We've to some degree have abandoned the term big data within CCO and replaced it with something closer to meaningful use. And that's because what we're really looking at is not the breadth and volume of data, but whether or not we have the right data at the right time. So one example I thought of, which I think it's a relevant one given that this audience is very different than what I'm used to. I'm used to basically nerds, the analysts and the clinicians. So an example that is relevant, but also especially given, at least to my right, is MRI machine usage in Ontario. This is a challenge. We have a supply and demand problem in Ontario when it comes to healthcare. And diagnostic imaging machines and access to machines is probably one of the biggest challenges for the province to be able to navigate between need, supply, and ultimately identifying efficiency. So we had an issue whereby hospitals, local health integration networks were making requests from the province to add additional either hours to MRI machines or to add additional machines without the necessary information and the information they needed to make a decision as to whether it was an appropriate ask. So what we did is we took, again, a massive amount of data at our disposal. This included wait times data. So we collect wait times information on every machine usage within Ontario. We have information on the efficiency, how that machine is used within that facility, including things like downtime, turnaround time between patients, cancellation rates. And then we merged all that information with information from behavioral scientists. So look at some of the reasons and how people behave when it comes to their appointments, how they interact with the staff at the facility, and look for differences across the system. What we ultimately created was basically a regression model. It was a model whereby the ministry of the hospitals themselves could plop in their ask for additional access or additional machines and see what impact that would have on things like efficiency and wait times. And it was a simple tool, a lot of complicated data in the background, but very simple tool to use, and gave them a common language by which they could speak to each other. So instead of assuming, for example, that the hospitals had done their due diligence in terms of determining need, they could speak the same language. They could use the same tool, identify, yes, adding another machine would reduce wait times by 20%, or not in some cases. And that was an example for us of how we can both demonstrate value for money in terms of new investment, but also how we can merge data sets together to create a single picture, a single forum by which individuals can, again, share a common conversation.
Terrific example, Jason, and so relevant in the healthcare sector. ELYSE, the same question in your sector and company.
Yeah, sure. I'll give maybe sort of one example that's live today and one that's coming. One is take wind power. And in wind power now, you have a wind farm. We now have the data coming through the system so that the wind turbines at the front of the farm are able to detect the direction, speed, and nature of the wind. And now, through big data, we calculate that, and that is being sent back to the rest of the turbines and the rest of the farm, so that by the time the wind moves through the rest of the wind farm, those turbines have re-angled themselves to capture the maximum efficiency of the wind that is blowing through that wind farm. And you're getting multiple percentage points of improved efficiency in a wind farm as a result of that. So that's live, happening today. Let me give you another example. I guess some of you have probably flown in a plane that's maybe been delayed. And so X% and I don't have the number here with me, but X% of your delays are caused by, as Steve was mentioned, unplanned downtime. In other words, you arrived, that plane arrived, you thought you were going to be boarding it, but you're not, because they found something now broken. Now, what we're working on, and currently sort of doing to some degree, but it's only going to escalate, is with sensors going on the jet engines, which are there now, getting terabytes of data on every flight. What we're capturing is the performance of the jet engine, and this is happening throughout the rest of the plane as well, so that you can determine while in flight, real time, whether or not a part or something needs to be changed prematurely, or it's starting to fail, so that not that you would have had a problem that flight, but 2 or 3 flights from that point, something might have happened that was unready. It's like your car telling you it needs an oil change today, as opposed to in another, 300 kilometers. That can happen with planes now, and think of the savings, because now you can have the part and the technician at the place where they need to be when the plane comes in, take care of that change or that maintenance issue, and basically predict the problem, fix it before the problem ever happens, thereby actually eliminating those unplanned delays. Huge savings, and something that only the sensing technology, the big data capability to absorb all this data, and the predictive nature that you can get from big data allows you to do. So very exciting, and huge efficiencies today in something like a wind farm, and tomorrow in terms of all our lives, in terms of how people manage or avoid unplanned downtime.
Thank you. I think all of us are converts to the value of big data if it reduces plane delays. But in that vein, just a brief comment from each of you on why, how you're seeing it being an essential component in terms of evidence-based policy development and programs. There'd be different levels of use of big data and focus on outcomes. So Steve, I'll start with you again.
Yeah, I think it's key. The movement to evidence-based decision-making or outcome-based decision-making is big in government, and it's equally big in business, whether it's small business or large business. I was chatting with a gentleman at lunch about, in the past, we maybe made decisions based on gut feel. We had experience. We just knew the way things were, and we accepted that. This movement to outcome-based decision-making means that we need to adopt an analytics culture. We need to have technology enable us so that technology is going to work for us as opposed to working against us. I work at SAS, so I'm a little biased on the technology side, and like Jason, I am a bit of a geek, so I tend to go technology first, but you can't make these programs and these decisions purely based on a technology decision. It needs to be a combination of business and technology, or agency and technology, you can interchange the word, to really giving some weight behind the decision. I think if you let the data tell you the answer, you'd be surprised where you go sometimes. I've seen a lot of times where organizations get their data, they start doing analytics on it, and what they thought was the problem wasn't actually the problem at all. There's a famous story that is an analytics story, and if you've heard it, I apologize, but there's a thing called a correlation, where you can say this product goes with that product. And the logical one that people think about, well, toothpaste and toothbrushes kind of go together, maybe chips and dip kind of go together, peanut butter and jam, right? You would think they're logical pairings, and you would go in with a bias to say, I'm looking for that correlation or that relationship. One of the famous ones is a large retailer in the US did some analysis, and they found that beer and diapers were highly correlated. So when people bought beer, they also bought diapers. Now there's 100 reasons why that story might be the case. But I think it
Maybe you don't want to take us too deep in that big data analysis, Steve.
This isn't about Nick's underwear again.
No, it's not, no. I guess the point of the story is that if you go in with a bias, which most people do, and don't look at the data to make your decisions, you could end up with an outcome that's different than you thought, or you might be ignoring an outcome that's staring you right in the face. So that's my thoughts.
Well emphasized. Jason, your perspective.
So I think, lots of different ways you could take this. I think the two ways we're seeing analytics applied mostly to things like policy formation and evaluation is in two realms. Number one is evaluation. And that's because what certainly the healthcare system's been quite poor at historically is looking at evaluating outcome and impact and planning for that type of measurement at project outset. So instead of waiting until your project is a year or 2 years into implementation, you've made a significant investment, and then deciding you have to evaluate whether or not you're basically getting what you anticipated, is starting to plan for those types of activities at the very first part of the meetings to plan for implementation, so that the information you're collecting is something that's part of that overall project plan. The second one is more on the predictive modeling side. I say more and more, given, again, a very fiscally constrained environment and some important decisions having to be made about where to invest, the ability to take some of those analytics, do some predictive modeling, and do some, be able to present some anticipated outcomes and both the breadth and the impact of those outcomes is something that's becoming more and more critical in that decision making, as it should. Obviously recognizing that there's always a risk in relying too much on predictive models based on, again, what kind of information you're feeding it. But it's providing more and more information on a relative scale as to what your project or what your initiative is likely to produce in terms of a tangible outcome, and allowing people to make some of those informed decisions in the planning and implementation stage.
Yeah, very well said. And you've described as well, Jason, how organizations and companies can start using big data. So ELYSE, I'm going to sort of segue us to your perspective as a large organization. If you look at our diverse audience, what would be your advice in terms of how organizations or companies that aren't currently leveraging big data could get started?
Sure. We started a couple of years ago when our chairman, Jeff Immelt, I think to his credit, he's always sort of captured trends that were happening and been there early. And I think started to see the importance and the critical nature of big data to where the future was going to be. So we made a huge pivot, I guess it's 5 or 6 years ago now, to say that we are going to totally understand and become a digital industrial company. And so over the course of, what's on the agenda today was not even on the agenda, I would say 6 years ago, because it started probably 4 or 5 years ago. And it started with us investing significantly in getting into the company, the talent, the people who know what the heck this is. And so we did it, GE's big, so we did it in a big way. We started something called San Ramon, where we brought in a year and a half over 1,200 data scientists and software developers and architects down right in Silicon Valley. We brought in a couple of big leaders from some of these big firms and said, help us understand this because we don't understand it. And now, as of about a couple of weeks ago, we actually created a digital company within our company because we felt, you know what? Our traditional P&L guys who are used to selling the hardware, the turbines, the jet engines, they may not simply fully understand the breadth of the change, the transformation that we've been hearing about for the past, 12 hours since last night. So if we want to move as quickly as we think this market is moving, we have to almost take it away from our traditional core people. So we have now put inside, we have taken this software team, this San Ramon team, and we have bundled an entire business around it. We're hiring all from the outside and picking only sort of the youngest or the folks that came from this world to begin with into the company. And it's fantastic. And so then you say, well, how does that affect me? That's GE. And I think what it shows us, though, and we did a deep dive for the executives 2 weeks ago. We spent 4 hours just hearing from these guys that we've brought in from all different, our competitors and all different companies, teaching us. And I'm finally, personally, really understanding the breadth and depth of this transformation. And my comment to everyone would be, bring some of these people into your organization. Have them with you. They will tell you and help you find new ways to get the outcomes that you have been focused on. You're going about it however you go about it, but you bring in a data scientist, a software, I think it's a developer, and a software architect or data architect. These are the groups that we've pulled together into our Calgary Innovation Center. The solutions and outcomes we are coming up with for customers in just, an 18, 15-month time period is phenomenal. And we couldn't have done it before because we didn't have the language. We didn't understand it. I'm from that different generation. And the young guys that I have in, the average age is definitely a lot lower than, what was PwC? They said 27. It's around that space. They've grown up in it. They get it. They're going to school in it. And they're bringing it into our company. And I think the sooner all of us do that, the more you will understand the extent of the transformation that is happening. And I think if you don't do it, sorry to be long, I think if we don't do it, you run the risk that this is changing so fast, you will miss it. You simply will miss it. And it's going to move on exponentially, and you won't be able to catch up.
Yeah, thank you for that sort of passionate advocacy, starting with talent, and even in a big corporation, a bit of that, how you, spin out, if you will, a different group to greenhouse the capability. Steve, maybe I'll wrap around to you for a final question. You'd see a range of clients. Again, for an organization or company that hasn't started, what would your advice be?
Yeah, so I think to ELYSE's term, big data is just a term. I think you've got to look at your data and understand what you want to get out of it and store what you want to store. There's technology out there that lets you keep pretty much everything for a fairly low price point. So the barriers of traditional technology have been kind of torn down. So I think don't think about it as big data, think about it as your data. I think Jason highlighted a couple things around analytics. Obviously, SAS is an analytics company. That's what we do. We help companies organize themselves and deliver analytic outcomes to the business, to the agency, to the world. I think about your analytic outcome. A term was mentioned by both Jason and ELYSE, a data scientist. Some of you might not know what a data scientist is. But a data scientist is someone who's probably kind of geeky, I think I can safely say that. They're going to be a bit of a programmer. They're going to be a data person, but they're going to be naturally curious. And if you start digging into this, the talent gap that we talk about in big data and analytics, you're going to hear that there aren't a lot of these people around. I think there's probably more in your business, your agency, your organization than you think. We've had success pulling people from very weird places in our organization, in our finance group, and saying, holy cow, this person's become a data scientist because they have that natural curiosity. So speaking of talent, I think don't worry if you hear that there's a talent gap. There's lots of agencies here or institutions here that have masters of analytics and have analytic tracks in their programs. So the gap is getting filled. The other comment I'll make that plays off a little bit of what Lisa said is you need to be agile. You need to think about your organizational structures. The traditional command and control sort of structures don't work with some of these people. They're used to sitting in their garage or sitting in their basement programming. You need to have some flexibility in terms of what you bring them in for from an HR perspective, but also in terms of how you react. I like to tell organizations, fail fast. Figure out what you want to solve for, try it out. If it doesn't work, abandon it and move on. You never know what you're going to find until you start digging into these problems. So summary, look for the talent. It's not always where you might think. I think be agile to adapt to this new cycle time and just stay focused. Like start small and stay focused on that problem that you want to solve, because every organization we talk to has one, and the more you can flush it out, the more you can add value to your customer or your citizen. Thanks,
Steve. And Jason, you're with a smaller organization.
Value
a few of your insights.
So I'll communicate the lesson learned that we had. So we, similar to ELYSE, recognize the need to build a talent pool of analysts. And I generalize analysts, everything from scientists to industrial engineers. What we did initially is we created this big central analytics pool and found within about 2 years there was a significant problem with our analytics, and that methodologically it was quite sound, but it didn't resonate with either the patients or the business or the programs. And what we found was a centralized model versus a more distributed model was a problem, because they weren't getting the subject matter expertise they needed to understand the context within which they're doing those analytics. So over the last while, in addition to getting the talent to come to the organization, is we are entrenching analytics teams within specific subject matter areas. So over a period of a year or 2 years, not only are they analytics experts, but they're fairly proficient in the subject matter in which they are working. And the value and the quality of the analytics have skyrocketed as a result of that model. So it's not just the talent acquisition, it's how you engage them within an organization.
Yeah, very, very interesting comment on organizational structure and sort of approach. I'm going to, around just before we came up to the stage, we were talking about one of the gnarlier issues around big data, which is the question of data privacy. And how can you balance extracting the benefits, the outcomes of all this information while protecting privacy, whether it's customers or citizens? ELYSE, I'll start with you on that question.
Yeah, I would say I don't pretend to have the answer. I would make a couple of comments. Certainly as a business, I think a global business, we have found Canada generally to have some rules and regulations around this, but for the most part, I think benefiting, particularly in the healthcare space, the consumer. I think the challenge is, though, as the world, and I'll defer to my more technical friends here, but as the world has moved much more to putting this big data into clouds and lakes, if we need to see how Canada is structured to do that, because we may, for different businesses, that takes an investment to create that cloud. And if you always have to separate out the Canada cloud from maybe your North American cloud, in order to protect a piece of data that maybe isn't that important to privacy, you could lose out on the cloud not coming to Canada or not including Canadian applications. So I think the world of privacy needs to understand what's happening on the IT side as they do, but where it's going, just in order to make sure that we're not over-regulating around the privacy piece. Because if we're not managing that risk well, I think we could preclude ourselves from some of the future direction. And maybe you guys can probably speak to it better than I can, but I just worry that if we're a little too protective in the wrong places or without the right information and err on the side of conservatism, I think that could have a negative impact in the scheme of things around investment and application of new technology. But
And Jason, great handoff
Yeah,
to Jason,
yeah.
because you'd be in the, sort of the crux of privacy
Sure.
issues.
Yeah,
Sure.
it's probably one of the biggest challenges we're currently facing. And
Yeah.
what I'll say is, we've all recognized it's not how necessarily strict the legislation is. It has been the pervasive interpretation of that legislation in a very risk-averse way. And that's a challenge we're facing right now. It's not that we have our hands tied through legislation. It's that in the absence of clarity, people will ultimately go with the most risk-averse approach when it comes to information. And in Ontario, we've recognized the breadth of healthcare data is massive, but our ability to share it openly is incredibly restricted based on, again, of that perception. And so what we're having to do, and the cloud is a great example, we were trying to engage Ontario hospitals to start storing much of their information on patients in the cloud and getting significant pushback. So when Microsoft announced that they're putting a local cloud into Toronto, that certainly, it immediately disappeared. But really the situation hasn't changed whatsoever. It's just individuals' comfort and perception of the cloud, what it means in terms of security and privacy. And for them, in their backyard is a much more comfortable feel. But I think what we have to do both in terms of things like the technology aspects, but also the protection of information, is we have a significant amount of education to do, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's private industry, about what the nature of these industries are, what the nature of the protection is, and the balance between, again, opportunity and risk.
can I make one comment just on
You
that?
can.
Because I think what becomes really important is concurrent with all this development is cybersecurity. Because there is technology development, but you can't think that you're going to engage in all this and build, sort of a stronger database and stronger systems and put sensing and all these things into your equipment, and then not concurrently be moving your sophistication, up, increasing your sophistication around how to protect the data that you're now collecting and managing. So, we just invested, we bought a fantastic company in Vancouver called World Tech that's one of the world leaders in this area. And I think, I've learned a lot through them too, but this whole area of making sure if you're a hospital and you've got all this data now, you have to make sure it's not enterprise risk, it's the data that's residing on a lot of the equipment or a utility or any operator. So we have to make sure our knowledge is moving concurrently in that whole area of how to protect the data we're now taking responsibility to collect.
You bet, and a lot of headlines around that. I'm going to move to Steve just to bring us home on this question.
Yeah, I'll give you two quick stories. My wife's in healthcare, and she works with patient information every day. And we have to have a fax machine in our house so she can fax documents around. And as a technologist, I just breaks every fiber of my being. But I think it's a reality that we've accepted in certain verticals and certain industries that privacy has to be protected at all costs. And I think the data phenomena, the analytic phenomena, the big data, Internet of Things, sensors, whatever the term is you want to use, creates a pretty powerful platform to do some interesting things. And I'll quote either Spider-Man or Allaire and say, it's with great power comes great responsibility. It's Peter Parker's uncle said that, in case you were wondering. So we've got to figure it out, right? I think that the bottom line on privacy is the next generation of people coming up have no concept of privacy. Anybody on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat, any of these social platforms, people give stuff up that I would never give. Create a website called robmyhouse.com. I don't know. But there is a lot of data out there. Privacy is key, and organizations have to treat that data with as much respect and intimacy as they would the customer standing in front of them. And that's going to be different for every customer and industry.
Yeah, and very interesting comment because about perceptions catching up because that fax machine has security issues as well, I suppose.
It's a little more secure, I guess, but whatever.
Let's go to a final question that's a bit fun before we go to our audience for their questions. Proliferation of sensor data, Internet of Things that was referenced from mobile phones, fitness trackers, cars driving. What do you think is the next big thing for organizations to consider? Give us a bit of your future view. Maybe Steve, will start with you.
Well, I think you got them all. I was watching the news this morning, and we're now allowing cars to drive automatically. I think Tesla's the only car that has it today. I know there's some folks from GM here. I'm sure we're not far behind, but it's hard to say. I think anything that involves the generation of detailed data about you is likely going to be a hit. Who would have thought a fitness tracker where you could log your calories would have been such a hit? I actually heard someone say, I'm not going to go to the gym today because I've got to get my steps in, which I thought, again, was kind of an odd thing. But I think anything where people can feel more intimate with the data they create is going to be probably a hit in this climate.
Thank you. Jason?
It's a less fun answer, but I think in the realm of big data, for us in healthcare, I think the concept of personalized medicine is the one that's gaining most traction. Someone said earlier today, things like genomics data, where our ability to process massive amounts of information quickly is constantly evolving. And so being able to tailor an individual's interaction with the healthcare system and tailor their healthcare plan based on their individual needs is something that I think is the future. And ultimately, a lot of evidence has already shown that for many of the genetic markers for cancer and things like that, you can have targeted medicines that are much more beneficial in certain populations of people. Our challenge is when it comes to things like sensors and so on is separating the signal from the noise. And this is, I think, it's a big data problem overall, which is as you're gathering more and more information, how do you truly tease out, again, that meaningful element from all the other noise and background that's surrounding it?
Maybe not as fun, but absolutely transformative to have individualized, healthcare solutions. ELYSE?
Well, I'll move from the consumer space to my world, which is the business-to-business world, and I just think there are 50 billion machines out there. You look at all forms of power generation, every solar machine, wind turbine, gas turbine, steam turbine. You move into the air conditioning space, ventilation, motors, generators. These can now all be connected to one another. And by connecting them to one another and collecting the data from them and having them talk to one another, you can create an industrial internet that can have as much, if not even more impact than what the consumer internet has had in the past, 20 years, 15 years. Now imagine that it hasn't really come to the industrial space, but that is what's coming. And when you think about all that interconnectedness, apply it to how things run, apply it to the next generation of manufacturing facility, where it's a brilliant plant, where things are seamlessly connected to the supply chain, inventories are there's just a whole new way of driving business, efficiencies and productivities that we've not begun to see, but I think is going to move suddenly very quickly in the next 5 to 10 years.
Thank you. And I think we'll stop there because we have a couple of minutes for the audience to ask questions, and we have just an outstanding panel who've brought to life the opportunity and some challenges with big data and its outcomes. Do we have a question in the audience? The lights are pretty bright. Wave your hand. Mid back on my left.
Thank you. Sean Murray from SAS, actually. And we've heard everybody comment and talk about the importance of having the right people. At least you kicked that off by telling everyone how you're bringing in the data scientists and the importance of that role in being able to extract value from big data. And of course, the associated skills shortage. So my question for everybody is, how do organizations build a culture to be able to not only attract but retain these important analytical skills?
Great question. Thank you. Who wants to kick in with the first answer, Elise?
Sure. What we've been going through this, and it's a great question because it really is a cultural change. Going back to that panel on sort of the new workforce, the change of work. And we certainly found, I loved the comment Jason made about integrating these folks into the business and close to the customer. So I look at our little microcosm in Calgary where we've built this innovation center. We had process engineers who were focused on the customer. And we wanted to bring in data scientists, data engineers, but not a lot of them. And we had a big debate with the folks in California, in Silicon Valley, San Ramon, whether or not to keep them clustered where there are 1,200 data scientists and everything else down there, or bring them up to Calgary where they'd be closer to the customer. So we sort of divided and conquered, and we left some down there and we brought some up. We're moving everybody up because they love being we thought they wanted to be with others like themselves. They want to be close to the problem.
Yeah.
And so just to your point, they're thoroughly engaged they're fabulous with the customer. They're thoroughly engaged in solving the problem at the forward-facing sort of, intersection of customer, problem, and solution. And then we have they can refer back to the core, but it's great to have the people out in the front, close to the market, close to the problem, working on it. And they're happy. So that's what matters. They're really happy.
Yeah, and I would layer on that it does need to be a cross-functional team. You mentioned you've got your business-centric folks, you've got your customer-facing folks, you've got your technologists, your data scientists. You do need to have a broad range. And what that allows you to do is kind of hedge a little bit on any one role or one type of person. Because if you spread it around and everybody learns a little bit of everything, working in a cross-functional team for analytic outcomes and for big data projects certainly makes it easier to staff because you're not looking for all of one thing that might be in short supply, but also hedges your bets in terms of the talent pool being, I think the word's poached or moving on quickly, because there is virtually unlimited opportunity for these types of skills in the industry,
very
in the
hot
market.
skills.
So.
Jason, from your
I
perspective.
would say from us, we've had a lot of successful interactions partnering with academia. So start early, develop their interest and passion while they're still within their learning programs. Many of including myself, many of our executives hold appointments at academic institutions and teach actively, not just for the value of teaching, but also to try to, again, generate that passion very early on, so that by the time they're finished their program, they already are on a path that we can then help to support in terms of experience. And I think that has helped us because it's one of the things that we can do, again, in the reality of this world, which is public sector having more and more difficulty competing with private sector in some of these skill sets. Our developers, our data architects are incredibly high demand, and so being able to again generate the passion early and then maintain that support over time has been a critical factor of retaining them.
Yeah, well, we started with a comment on talent, and we're wrapping up with a focus on talent, which is predominated. I think that's all the time we have for our panel. Let me give my warm thanks for bringing big data and the big deal around big data to life. Just outstanding. Thank you.